That's real. It's a book that thick. And it describes what lawyers must do to present evidence. It talks about the various kinds of evidence. It talks about firsthand knowledge. It talks about expert testimony, competency of witnesses, demonstrative evidence, authentication, best evidence, official written statements, and that's important to our field, and records, and lots of more things. I mean, you couldn't boil that book down and talk about it all in 3 months. So what I've done is picked out those kinds of evidence. And the first one that they talk about is firsthand knowledge. And according to McCormick, the common law system of proof is exacting in its insistence upon the most reliable sources of information. A witness that testifies to a fact that can be perceived by the senses must have an opportunity to observe and have actually observed the facts. That's firsthand knowledge. All of you that investigate UFOs deal with that firsthand knowledge in every case you investigate. You talk to the person that made the observation. Now in slide 2, I'd like to point out that we have a case of firsthand knowledge, and this is a Portland, Oregon police case. It happened in July 7th, 1947. Any of you interested in that date? Roswell. Well, this documents eyewitness reports over Portland, Oregon, and this is a memorandum to the officer in charge. It was originally classified as confidential, and it's relabeled unexplained. That's firsthand evidence. It is unexplained. And what they're talking about in there is when I put it into the proceedings, some of you may read the proceeding and say, well, you got typos in it. Well, there's typos in that document I just showed you. For instance, when they spell pigeons, they didn't spell it the right way. They spelled it P-I-D-G-E-O-N-S. And little things like that. And a lot of researchers say, well, a government document wouldn't be misspelled, so it's obviously a fake. It's not a fake. That's the way people work, you know. Lots of people can't spell. But what they talked about was on July 4th, a radio alert was issued by the Portland City Police Radio advising all cars and listeners that some fast flying objects were in the air over Portland and vicinity. Upon contacting the radio dispatcher, this agent, that's the government agent that did the investigation, was advised that Kenneth A. McDowell, patrolman, Portland City Police Department, he gave his address and everything, had called in advising the dispatcher of flying objects. And again, this agent interviewed McDowell. The agent had first-hand testimony as well, who stated that he was on duty and in the parking lot of the police station. And this is where he got to the pigeons. At this time, the pigeons became very excited over something and fluttered in the air all at once. We had an animal reaction that this agent recorded in the report, which is kind of interesting. And he, looking around to see what disturbed him, he saw 5 large discs in the air. Not 5 nebulous things, 5 discs. And 2 were flying south, 3 were flying east. And he said he could determine no color to the disc, but advised they were dipping up and down in an oscillating motion and were traveling at great speed. And he went on to say about speed and all. But again, the oscillating motion is very much like Kenneth Arnold had reported just recently before that in Kenneth Arnold's sighting. Nobody connected the two, though, unfortunately. Then this agent went to interview Sergeant Claude Cross, Oregon State Police, and he was on duty. And when he heard the alert, he went out and was looking in the easterly direction and saw 3 discs following each other. And it goes on to talk about that. And then this agent interviewed Earl F. Patterson, patrolman, Portland City Police Department. And he advised that he was a former Air Corps pilot in World War II. He stated that at the time of the radio alert and where he was located and all that, he saw 1 disc going southwesterly over Portland. He said it was aluminum in color, left no vapor trail or smoke, was traveling at terrific speed, faster than he had ever seen any flying object before. He advised that although not knowing the exact size, it was very high up, etc. This was an official military report in 1947. This fits our type of firsthand testimony, and you can't question the credibility. Now, another firsthand testimony, one that I have mentioned before that I was interested in, has been astronaut reports. Most of them have been debunked by the debunkers, not by the people that reported them, not Gordon Cooper or any of these folks. But one that was very interesting to me was on Gemini 4, because it was kind of the start of my time in the UFO field. On slide 3, I'll show you the cover. This is the cover of the working paper, the NASA working paper. That's the composite ground-to-air transmissions, and this was recorded in that. You will notice it is unclassified, so it's not something I stole. It's legitimately obtained. On that paper, it does say at the bottom, at the time when it came out, it was exempt from disclosure. Now, that exempt stamp is very interesting, too, because exempt doesn't mean that you can go to the FOIA and get it. You cannot. It's exempt. It's not, even if it wasn't classified, you still couldn't get it. But nevertheless, this is the transcript, and I want to go through this transcript a little bit because this is kind of the way it works in the space program. The folks on the ground, Capcom talks to the crew on orbit. And Gemini 4 was talking through Hawaii. There were certain ground stations back in those days before we had the TDRS as satellites that they had to talk through the ground station. Then there was a gap in between the ground station when they couldn't talk. And Gemini 4, Guam is Capcom, and he said, "Go ahead, Gemini 4. Roger, we got you green. How you doing up there?" "Fine. I just saw something else up here with me." Ugh. But just as I was getting close enough to it to get a good picture, the sun got in the way and I lost it. "Well, we got some flight plan changes for you." Nobody said, "Well, what did you see?" "We got some flight plan changes for you." And he went on anyhow, and Jim McDivitt said, "I thought it was when I first saw it." Well, whoops, missed something. They continued talking about this thing on and on and on. And they said, "Stand by." And they went on down for a while talking about various other things. There's a time hack on this that tells exactly the hour, minute, and second mission elapsed time. It tells who's speaking. And they talked about there was a thunderstorm often that they were observing, and they did take pictures of thunderstorms in those times. And then way on down in the discussion, Capcom said it's 32:45 elapsed time. And then Capcom said, "That's affirmed. You still looking at that thing up there?" First thing that they ever said again after he said that. And of course he said, "No, I've lost it," etc. And that's pretty much what was in that transcript. However, on April 12, 1974, the Today Show on NBC TV with Edwin Newman, astronaut Brigadier General James A. McDivitt. See, this was no little man. This guy was pretty darn important. And Congressman J. Edward Roush, a congressman that was one of the brave ones that looked into UFOs back in those days. Of course, he wasn't reelected the next time. They talked about several things. One, they talked about McDivitt and the fact that he had actually talked to abductee Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. And that was kind of a revealing thing because most of us hadn't heard that part of Jim's interest. And Newman said, "General McDivitt, you spoke to Hickson?" He said, "Yes, I did." "How soon after this allegedly happened?" See, allegedly happened. And talking to a general, he talks down like it's alleged. "Oh, it was probably a month or so afterwards, but I was really convinced. I think Charles Hickson is telling the truth as he knows it. He is not the type of guy who goes out and looks for publicity or anything." "What do you mean by as he knows it?" "Well, I don't know whether or not it really happened, but I guess I wouldn't know unless I were actually there. But I think what he says happened. He's really convinced it happened." And he went on and he talked about, is there any proof, etc. And then Ralph Bloom chummed in and said he thought we would never have any contact with extraterrestrial life on other planets. "Don't you agree with that, Jim McDivitt?" And Jim McDivitt said, "No, I think they're really around, and I hope that someday, maybe not in this decade, maybe not even in this century or the next century, but someday, I hope we can communicate. We're not very smart as a group of people, you know. We've only been around a few thousand years, and Earth is a few billion years old, so we got a long ways to go. And then Newman said, well, what did you see or think you saw on Gemini 4? Think you saw? The man took pictures. You know, those kind of things are what upsets us in this field. When you've got expert testimony, you've got firsthand witness, and people pretend like, well, maybe it's not all real. You know, Newman said, well, could it have been an upper stage of the rocket? Yeah, well, that's what it must be. But Newman said, no. No, I thought it was when I first saw it, but it turned out that we looked at the records and there weren't any upper stages of rockets anywhere near us. So it could not have been. Newman said, have you thought much about this? You thought about life on other planets? And Madiba goes on to talk about this at some length. I hope you will pick up the proceedings and read that whole sequence of things and look at the innuendos in it, look at the facts in it. The person that's giving the first-hand eyewitness testimony, those are the facts. This other stuff is noise. It seems to get in to try to move the facts around a little bit. McDivitt did take pictures. And what irritated him was afterwards, when he asked to look at the pictures, what he was shown, what he said, is not what I photographed. And all you can do then is throw your hands up in the air. Well, there are another group of first-hand witnesses that we put a lot of stock in, and that's airline pilots and military pilots. And recently, we had a real recent one that Peter Davenport, who you're going to hear later on, received at his National UFO Reporting Center. And he got this report from an FAA air controller. It was on March 25th of this year. A dish-shaped object came up near an aircraft, flew parallel to them for 15 minutes. Now, you think a pilot would notice something for 15 minutes and not be sure? That's ridiculous. Of course they would. That's how you all stay alive when you fly on airliners. All the time the UFO was visible, the pilot talked to the control tower. 15 minutes of discussion with the control tower. The FAA man on the ground went to Peter's website and filed a report. And we say, hooray for the FAA man. Later on, Peter asked the man to join him on Coast to Coast with George Noory. And the guy said, sure. And his supervisor said, well, yeah, that's okay. But the supervisor said, nah, I don't think so. And he didn't show. I'm sure Peter can tell you a lot more about that. Well, there's another type of evidence, and that's expert testimony. And McCormick, Book of Law, again says, an observer is qualified to testify because he has firsthand knowledge of the situation. The expert has something different to contribute. This is a power to draw inferences from the facts which a jury would not be competent to draw. And then to warrant the use of expert testimony, you have two elements that you must adhere to. First, the subject of the inference must be so distinctively related to some science, profession, business, or occupation as to be beyond the ken of the average layman. And second, the witness must have sufficient skill, knowledge, or experience in a field or calling as to make it appear that his opinion or inference will probably aid the trier in the search for truth. Now that is significant. MUFON has 190 consultants with MDs, PhDs, JDs, etc. Another 174 research specialists with master's degrees. These people are experts in their fields. These people are also expert then in the UFO field. They meet all the criteria for McCormick's document on law, the law of evidence. So right here in MUFON, we have a tremendous resource of expert capability, and we associate with expert capability of other organizations, the Center for UFO Studies, the Fund for UFO Research, the National Institute of Discovery Science, several other groups. And these people are all qualified to fit that testimony. If they say it, you should be listening to it, not making fun of it like is done sometimes. Now, let me give you just a couple of examples that have contributed. One is our good friend, nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman. He's presented a lot of papers, but in one paper in 2001, he's presented one called Flying Saucers and the Cosmic Neighborhood. And in this, I quote him, said, "There is overwhelming evidence that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft originating in our cosmic neighborhood." Anybody can't understand that? That's pretty darn clear. Another expert, an older one that most of you probably never met, but it was Professor Hermann Oberth. He was the father of the German V-2 rocket. And he said, and I have this in documentation, "I am most satisfied by the hypothesis that we are dealing with flying machines. So far, other plausible explanations have not been found. If we accept this as a working hypothesis, we also have to assume that these flying machines were not built by humans. We cannot produce machines that fly as UFOs do, for example, at speeds of more than 42,000 miles an hour measured by radar." Now, Professor Oberth was working on that rocket in the end of World War II. And he said then they were not built by humans. So you can't ignore that era. And in 1992, Russian cosmonaut Pavel Popovich spoke at our symposium. And he said, "The influence the UFOs has on people as well as the effects it produces should become the items of special research. The UFO's interaction with the environment, the behavior it motivates, and its genesis also present interesting areas for concentrated study." And one more that spoke at our symposium, most of you know Dr. Jacques Vallée. We have great respect for him and his long-term research and his association with Dr. J. Allen Hynek. And he said in his paper to MUFON, "I have come to the conclusion that a genuine UFO phenomenon exists. It is physical and it is unexplained. Therefore, I continue to investigate the sightings in this field." One that you're going to hear Sunday morning I've thrown in is Dr. Bruce Maccabee. He is bringing us the latest information on the Mexican UFO sighting. But he said in 1986 in his symposium presentation, "For more than 50 years, the science establishment has ignored the UFO problem, relegating it to the domain of true believers and mental incompetence. Scientists have participated in a self-cover-up, refusing to look at the credible and well-reported data. Furthermore, some of these scientists who have studied the data have published explanations which are unconvincing or just plain wrong and have gotten away with it because most of the rest of the scientific community has not cared enough to analyze those explanations." That's pretty startling when you think how big our scientific community is. Okay, there is another classification. That's the competency of witnesses. You know, lots of times you see documentaries of the like that will tell the story and then they'll bring out some stooge that will make a statement that sounds like the witness is incompetent. These are people that aren't, normally not at all incompetent. But what McCormick's Handbook of Law of Evidence says on that, in the Rule 101 of the Model Code of Evidence, it provides that every person is qualified to be a witness to any material matter unless the judge finds that the proposed witness is unable to express himself concerning the matters to be understood by the judge and jury, and either directly or through interpretation by one who can understand him, or the proposed witness is incapable of understanding the duty of a witness to tell the truth. So McCormick allows this eyewitness testimony and considers it competent unless there's only two criteria that aren't met. And that means the person can't tell you and can't tell the truth. So in UFO testimony, we see this so much. There's quite often a devious attempt. Sometimes it's through shrugging of the shoulders. Sometimes it's through little funny looks on the face. Or sometimes it's through words that alleged and suggested and things like that. That seems to block this search for truth. But the flow of competent witnesses continues. We receive reports literally every day from somewhere in the world. Many of you have worked on those, and you know firsthand that these people are competent. They're able to give their report factually, and we ought to be listening to them. But there are some competent witnesses that even the naysayers can't shoot down. I want to give you a couple of those. Like slide 7 is an intelligence report, air intelligence report. This was dated in 1948. This is the cover of it. It has a number of things in this report. But just to show you, this was on the front of the MUFON Journal. We published the whole thing in the MUFON UFO Journal. So it has been made public, and We might even republish it one of these days. One of the reports in there involves 4 credible witnesses, 1 in an aircraft and 3 on the ground. It reads, on 1 October 1948 at approximately 20:30 hours, the pilot of an F-51 aircraft, Second Lieutenant George F. Gorman, North Dakota Air National Guard, flying near Fargo, North Dakota, sighted an intermittent white light at about 3,000 feet below his 4,500 cruising altitude. The pilot pursued the light, which appeared to take evasive actions. The object or light outturned, outspeeded, and outclimbed the F-51 in every instance. The pilot lost contact 27 minutes after the initial sighting. The guy chased him for 27 minutes. Wall Enders got to know George Gorman, and we published his report in the MUFON Journal also. And years later, he still testified to the truth of it. But the same light was observed by 3 other witnesses on the ground. They were the air traffic controller, they wouldn't give the name, another air traffic controller, and an oculist. A comparison of all the testimony revealed that one object sighted was sighted, and it consisted only of a small round ball of clear light. Nevertheless, that is one that is an accepted testimony. Another is the police officer testimony. We have hundreds of police officer reports, and they continue. You heard one of our local police officers last night, Ken Storch, tell you the importance of this. And he understands eyewitness testimony and authentication and all these things that go with it. But that is one of the most competent sections of our society that report UFOs. And I say competent because, let me say, if you commit a crime and this police officer observes it and then writes you up, takes you in, then appears in court, you can bet his or her testimony is going to be accepted and yours is not going to win out over it. So when this same police officer reports a UFO, that should be considered exceedingly competent and be accepted. And our Indiana MUFON group, in their own newsletter, the Indiana Observer, in January and February of this year, gave a report from Huntington, Indiana. And in that case, there were 3 police officers say that a strange object drifted through the skies over northeastern Indiana, and they were looking for others, and they gave the names. Officer Chip Ollinger was warming up his car on December 26, 2003, and he reported seeing the circular object. He radioed 2 other officers, Greg Hendrick and Randy Hoover, and all 3 said they watched the object. So not only did you have 1 competent police officer reporting, you had 3 because they contacted each other by radio and at different locations observed. The same object. And so he said it stopped at times, it spun slowly, it even changed shape. It reflected sunlight, and it wasn't the kind of flying machine that I can think of. It's not like the 50s flying saucer. It was that big, but it didn't have the hump in the middle, which was interesting. And then on slide 8, this is an Air Intelligence Information Report. And it was by Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Baumgartner, USAF Director of Intelligence. He issued that report on September 21st, 1951. He cited the UFO report by 2 highly competent military officers. And the time was 11:35 Eastern Daylight Time, and the weather was CAVU. That means clear and visibility unlimited. When he spotted this object, it was at an estimated altitude of 8,000 feet, flying at 20,000 feet. He immediately made a diving turn in his T-33 and followed and timed the objects until it disappeared 2 minutes later. Both pilots observed the strange object. It appeared to be the size of an F-86, but much faster, more than 900 miles an hour. It was disc-shaped. It was steady in flight and had no visible means of propulsion. It was shiny silver in color. And at 11:10, a radar station at Fort Monmouth plotted an unidentified high-speed, above 700 miles an hour object at approximately the same location. The headquarters has no information regarding natural phenomena, experimental aircraft, or guided missiles that could have caused these observations. So they didn't say it's an unidentified flying object except in the title, but they say at the end, they went through these things and couldn't identify it. Now, there's still another kind of evidence. It's called demonstrative evidence. There's a type of evidence that consists of things that are distinguished from assertions of witnesses. It's about what they say about things. And that kind of evidence could be evidence or maps, models, sketches, diagrams, photographs, videotapes, and sound recordings. Now we deal, Dr. Bruce Maccabee and Jeff Sainio, on the national level, deal with this demonstrative evidence on a regular basis. Locally, Alejandro Rojas and Ethan Rich have been working with some of the same kind of evidence right here in Colorado. And it says in the law book, it is common for these things to be displayed and referred to without being formally offered or admitted to evidence as long as they support the oral testimony of the case. And that's what we look for. If somebody brings in a photo or something and said, I didn't see anything when I got my picture developed, there was something in the photo. Well, that may be for a real reason. But if the person says, I was watching this object and I took this photo or this videotape, then that is evidence that can be admitted in support of the oral testimony. And we get lots of that. So when we do a field investigation, for instance, no video, no photographs involved, we ask the people to make sketches. If there are multiple witnesses, we ask them to make sketches separate from each other so they don't copy each other. And that becomes part of this demonstrative evidence. Now, the one piece of demonstrative evidence that you're going to be hearing about tomorrow, Paula Harris is going to be talking about some of the things from Italy and what she heard over there about this. And Dr. Bruce Maccabee is going to give a presentation in this room tomorrow morning on his analysis work he has done in working with the people in Mexico. Not just quoting, but working with them, and that's what you need to do. I'd like to show you a 4-minute piece of videotape that Paula gave me to show you, and this was on Italian television, and Italian television says it's a UFO. You may, unless you speak Italian, you may not be able to understand this, but you need to see how it was covered in another country. I'm sure a lot of you saw how it was covered in this country. Can we roll the tape, please?
Sebbene moltissimi studi non si sa qual è l'origine della patologia di cui stiamo parlando.
Non andrà così male per quanto riguarda il clima come invece era stato previsto. Non arriva proprio l'anticiclone, il famoso anticiclone dell'Azzorre, ma quasi. Il maltempo ci ha sfiorato, oggi ci sfiora appena, ma le temperature tornano.
Non identificati ci sono i radar. Ad avvistarli vicino a Città del Messico è stato l'intero equipaggio di un Merlin C-26, un aereo delle forze aeree del Messico, che in una giornata chiarissima, senza alcuna perturbazione, ha osservato attraverso i radar, e queste sono le immagini della registrazione, e ad occhio nudo dapprima 2 strane luci che improvvisamente accelerano da 100 a 600 km all'ora, che poi diventano 3, 4, fino a 7. Cosa sono? Le ipotesi in questo caso si sprecano, da aerei segreti, dicono gli esperti, fino a navicelle extraterrestre. Queste luci, tuttavia, assomigliano molto a quelle che da alcuni anni sono osservate in diverse parti del mondo e di cui ricercatori italiani di varie università si stanno impegnando per scoprirne l'origine. Un luogo esemplare dove si osservano luci simili è Esdalen, una remota località norvegese, dove si vedono, si osservano e si registrano tali fenomeni, che al momento comunque rimangono un mistero.
Allora, la tragedia oggi in Iraq, alla decapitazione, al barbaro assassinio.
Limitate dove la potenza è elevatissima e poi a pochi centimetri di distanza praticamente nulla.
Al fenomeno, oltre alla presenza di campi elettromagnetici non superiori alla media, assicura il professore, ha concorso l'attività solare di quel periodo e la situazione del luogo con lo specchio di mare antistante e la montagna.
You can see that it's not just a UFO phenomenon, not just a UFO interest, but this struck the heart of the world. People wanted to see it. Now, the interesting part was that supposedly they couldn't see with the naked eye, but they could see with their forward-looking infrared equipment. This is the latest technology equipment that sees heated objects against a cold background. One of my interests has been detection techniques, future detection techniques. And I can assure you we have sufficient equipment around today to be able to detect virtually anything that flies. Unfortunately, we in MUFON and the civilians don't have access to it. But forward-looking infrared radar is used on ground vehicles, helicopters, aircraft, satellites, you name it. And it's a good part of our Homeland Defense initiative. And if you believe that something flies in the sky is detectable by infrared and it's not seen, you're kidding yourself. I contend that the objects over Mexico were also witnessed by U.S. equipment, but everybody has been totally mum on it. And all of the news incidents I saw, no one bothered to really go after, did the U.S. see this? And we did have one person that gave us some testimony that it was seen on March 6th, and as testified to by a certain organization in this country, but that's hearsay. I don't have that as sworn testimony that I could bring into a court. So when dealing with the testimony we're looking for, it doesn't fit. The next category I'd like to talk about is authentication. You're going to hear a lot about authentication from Ryan Wood when he talks about the documents he's got and how he went through the forensic analysis. That's part of the process of authentication. But what McCormick's handbook says, authentication is necessary to the introduction of most writings in evidence. The relevancy of the writing to a particular issue is dependent upon the existence of some connection between that writing and the event or the individual. In the legal sense, it has frequently been questioned whether the benefits of authentication are not outweighed by the time, expense, and occasional untoward results that entailed by the traditional negative attitude toward authentication of writings. Well, the thousands of UFO documents that have been released by the United States government are authentic and have been authenticated by virtue of the process of release. John Greenewald says he just put 140,000 documents up. He obtained all these legally through the Freedom of Information Act. They were all authentic documents and would stand up in any court of law. So when we do documentation, we try to record it in the same way. If possible, it's nice to have the eyewitness testimony given, taped, typed, and signed. And if it's really a humdinger of a case, actually have that signature notarized, and that would then become a document that could be taken into any court of law if you should want to. Remember, it needs to be done. Okay, the next one is the Chinese report from the Joint Staff in Washington on this next slide. I want to leave this one up just a little bit longer. The important part is what you see right there. The distribution on that document, and it is dated September 1989, and it talks about a sighting in China at 11:13 p.m. on September 6th, and he said that they saw a saucer-shaped object with a black gap at the edge. And that black gap is very similar to what David Sarita is going to be talking to you about. But this is a legal document out of the U.S. government, and the distribution included the Sink-Pack Fleet, which is Pacific Naval Fleet at Pearl Harbor, ComUS in Korea Intel, which is the intelligence agency in Korea, in Seoul, the FBIS in London, the FBIS in Washington, and a lot of other agencies. If there was nothing to it, why would they bother to go to these kind of agencies with this piece of documentation, which is authentic, by the way? Another one on the next slide. This is unidentified flying objects in Soviet airspace. It is very much the same as that one, only this one was in January 1991 and approved for release in 1997. We do have the declassification stamp on these, so we're not talking out of school. We're doing our job right. But a general said that one particular UFO had been photographed, and optical and thermal signals had been shown on the target on the screens of the pilots in the interceptor aircraft. Optical and thermal signals. Again, much like the Mexican case, thermal signals. This was out of Russia in '91, so there was no connection possibly to what we saw in 2004 in March. But the importance is that you have a general saying that it happened, and this is the kind of thing we had. And he said specifically, this was not an airplane. We have written testimony from eyewitnesses and photographs. Some observers were even convinced the speed of the object depended on the frequency of the pulsation of the lights. And some of our researchers have looked at that and tried to hypothesize if there's something related to the systems in UFO sightings, that the light does change as the speed changes. I don't know, but this is out of Russia. It was completely independent of anything that any of us have done in this country. And again, here he said it could be observed on radar screen and photographed. And he talks about the frequency of the various things. And when asked why he, as Commander-in-Chief of the Air Defense Forces, did not order the UFO shot down, he warned, it would be foolhardy to launch an unprovoked attack against an object that may possess formidable capacities for retaliation. He said that even if it's proven that some UFOs are a product of highly organized intelligence from a significantly more developed civilization than our own, any fight with such objects and their crews before a clarification of their intentions would be futile. There's the Russian general putting it right on the line, folks. And then we also had a Russian interceptor pilot report, and this was in 1991 also. And they gave the pilot's name, S. Prushkin, the commanding officer of the Air Force unit, reported a blip designated an aerial target had suddenly appeared on radar screens. Said, I received the coordinates of the target and a mission to take a look at it. According to the information from the command post, the object was located at an altitude of 4.5 kilometers. The weather was clear and cloudless, the visibility excellent, but a search for the target did not yield any results. I reported this and returned and headed home. Suddenly something made me turn my head. To the rear and to the right, I saw two cigar-shaped objects of considerable dimension. The length of the first was probably 2 kilometers and the second 400 meters. They were positioned one behind the other and were in good view against a background of clear sky. The smaller one cast a silver-gray color in the rays of the sun, and the larger one appeared to be lusterless. But I was not able to make out the details of structural features. And said he also noticed that the UFOs were moving sideways at great speed. I turned and began to close in, and suddenly both targets just disappeared from the field of vision. But the pips stayed on radar. According to the information from the command post, about 15 kilometers separated us at this point. And it went to the same distribution I showed you on the other of all of the military and intelligence organizations of this country. And you cannot question the authenticity of this document. But listen again, he still had it on radar, but couldn't see it when it disappeared from view. So maybe we need to start taking a little more serious look at the spectrum of the operation of these things. Visible light is a very narrow band. Infrared expands that band. And the electromagnetic spectrum is quite wide. Maybe there is a clue for us now that why, when people have said, I saw this thing just flying across the sky and it disappeared, and you say, well, they must have been drinking, or they must be nuts, or they were mistaken. Maybe they blinked their eyes and it turned. You know, all the excuses, but maybe the real thing is maybe it can disappear into the visible spectrum, but still be operating, and radar picks it up. It's sure worth looking at. Okay, another category is best evidence. McCormick cites Baron Gilbert in 1726 as one of the earliest treatises on evidence, saying, the first and most signal rule in relation to evidence is this, that a man must have the utmost evidence the nature of the fact is capable of. Further, the best evidence the nature of the case will admit of should always be required. If it's possible to be had, if it's not possible, then the next best evidence should be allowed. So when we talk best evidence, somebody says, well, give me your best case. Well, there's only one best case, folks. They're all good. In slide 11, I want to show you how the Air Force presented cases of best evidence. This was from the Northeast Air Command. It's a historical data document, 1 January through 30 June of 1952. It was declassified on September 25th of 1974. There's a section in it called Unconventional Flying Objects. Somebody said, why are you using unconventional flying objects as the title of your symposium? Because it was in the Paul Hill book? Well, no, it's because we've used that for a long time. And here the government used it in 1952. They recognized that these things that have been reported had been investigated. They were not airplanes, they were not Venus, they were not all these other explanations. They were unconventional flying objects. In 1952, the year the objects were over the White House. And they are still unconventional flying objects. These other things have been identified. And in a section on there, identified as unconventional objects, it says several instances involving visual sightings of unconventional flying objects were reported in the Northeast Air Command during this period of this history. The first occurred at Corner Brook in western Newfoundland near Ernest Harmon Air Force Base on 18 April. 2 sightings were made by Newfoundlanders within a period of 18.5 hours. The objects were described as round, elliptically shaped, yellow gold in colored, and an estimated altitude of 2,000 feet and a speed of 500 miles an hour. And then 2 days later, on 21 June, an unidentified aerial object was sighted at Goose Bay Air Force Base by an officer of the 373rd Major Port. This object, described as disc-shaped, was traveling at a very slow rate of speed. No sound was audible, and it gradually gained altitude. It was first observed at an altitude of 1,000 feet, and for a flying thing, 1,000 feet is very low, folks. This object appeared white in color, and light seemed to radiate from it. It was observed for 5 minutes. So you have it right from their own report and their own historical document for 1952 that it was an unconventional flying object and it wasn't all these other things. Now, an attempt by UFO organizations to provide best evidence was made back in 1995. The Center for UFO Studies, the Fund for UFO Research, and MUFON had gathered together as a coalition. We work together wherever we can on these things. We have sponsored research, and we've done all kinds of what I think really good things on a very low budget. But Lawrence Rockefeller financed the writing and publication of a document called Unidentified Flying Objects Briefing Document, the Best Available Evidence. And this document was distributed to heads of state around the world, to members of Congress, and to influential people. As far as I know, not one of those influential people came back and did anything about it. But what it did, it gave them a list of major expert witnesses, generals, heads of state, astronauts, police officers, and what they had said about UFOs. So you can see these were not crackpots, they were real people. It also then went through a large number of cases, nearly 100 cases, going back, way back in time and right up to the present day of that document, showing that they had been fully investigated and any one of them could be used as best evidence. Later, that book was republished by Whitley Strieber as a pocketbook, and because everybody had been clamoring for it. I don't know how many of you bought it, but if you want to walk around with something in your hand that says best evidence, you might see if any of these booksellers have it. Another category by McCormick is official written statements and records. And it notes that official written statements are admissible as evidence of the facts recited in them. Even if the first-hand knowledge requirement for the reports of official investigations is relaxed, the special trustworthiness of official written statements is found in the declarant's official duty and high probability that the duty to make an accurate report has been performed. And that kind of applies to any government document we get. When observed in this light, the thousands of official government UFO documents will provide powerful and unimpeachable form of evidence. Now, here is one that's pretty hard to ignore. Over Oak Ridge, Tennessee, atomic installations on October 13th, 1950, radar detection of unidentified flying objects over Oak Ridge, October 12, 1950, protection of vital installations, USAF radar installation in Knoxville at 11:35 p.m. Eastern Standard, October 12, picked up indications of 11 objects, perhaps more, traveling across the controlled area of the atomic installation at Oak Ridge. Altitude of objects varied from 1,000 to 5,000 feet. That, again, is very low. And courses from south to southeast, and density from reading made by light aircraft in equal size. They were to be about the size of a C-47. That was a twin-engine prop plane. Speed from 100 to 125 miles an hour. A fighter plane attempted to intercept in a few minutes, and radar reflected contact, but the plane reported no object could be seen either visually or on the plane's radar screen. So here we have it again. You couldn't see it. And since the Mexican case, I have been looking for more and more of these pieces of information where this has come up in official documentation. Another official report, the next slide, was Intelligence Officer J.W. Ackus writing an Air Intelligence Information Report, etc., cites another incident involving radar and aircraft. It was in 1978. And there he says that they detected a on radar an identified flying object. It appeared to be the same type of object that had been detected previously several times in the past. That's the kind of a revelation, isn't it? They were ready. When they saw it, they knew it was exactly the same thing they had been seeing in other days. I think that's pretty significant when it comes to this kind of a documentation. And then it became a skin paint. And they observed it for quite some time after that, from 1456 Zulu to 1515 Zulu. That's a pretty good period of time, about roughly 20 minutes. And at the time it commenced to turn, it was about 10 miles distance. Then it suddenly turned toward the northwest at a high rate of speed, and they lost contact at a distance of 58 miles. So they tracked this thing through all the maneuvers, and they had a skin paint of the radar on it. It wasn't an anomalous radar echo like you've been told so many times. And it told how it was lost and that sort of thing. Then another case, similar, the next slide please, similar to the Mexican case, it was an aircraft that was equipped for aerial warning equipment. And they had all kinds of instrumentation in this, and a copy of the flight director's log was released with the report. And there we see that this is the second page of it. It unfortunately blacks out the names, but on the left-hand side, you can see the titles of all the people that were involved. There were 18 people on this aircraft taking data. It was a massive data collecting airplane. And they said everything about it was a UFO. And I actually have the log page where they were writing in their logbook, and at the bottom it says this is an authenticated true report by the government. So there's no doubt about 18 radar operators tracking and following this object. And then another case, and this will be the last slide I'll bother you with. I think it's important you see these are real documents. They are admissible type documents. And this was a UFO tracked on radar over the northwestern United States. And it says it was tracked on ground and airborne radar. And it was picked up by Timothy. That was one of the aircraft. It has a radar scope in it, and it was estimated 200 knot speed. And they had a total of 3 sightings by that aircraft over a 10-minute period, after which time the target remained off. And then after it was picked up there, they codenamed Mercury, which was a direction setter, took immediate action to vector 2 fighter interceptors. And they used Pronto 1 and Pronto 2. Obviously, they were in a hurry. And to follow the blip, they tracked it for 28 miles. And they separated then into 2 distinctive blips, and they recorded that on radar. And they talked about it descended from 25,000 feet to 6,000 feet in altitude, and to an estimated distance of only 6 miles from them, with their speed increasing, though, from 0.85 to 0.9 Mach, almost the speed of sound. Then it slid off of the scope and was gone. There was another, though, an airborne radar picked up a target also. So you had ground radar, aircraft radar, and interceptor radar. And again, that's irrefutable evidence. And I could go on giving you documents like this for the rest of this next week. It's not necessary. I've demonstrated to you there are various kinds of evidence that's admissible in court. We should follow the rules of legal evidence and use that, and don't let anybody tell you it's not evidence. McCormick goes on to say one other thing that you need to know. People will tell you, prove it to me. I want to see the proof. Well, proof is in the eye of the observer, really. It's not something that you can tell somebody something day after day and they say, it doesn't prove it to me because I don't want to know. But McCormick says proof is an ambiguous word. We sometimes use it to mean evidence, such as testimony or documents. Sometimes when we say a thing is proved, we mean that we are convinced by the data that the alleged fact is true. Thus, proof is the end result of conviction or persuasion produced by evidence. When you get your evidence in place, that is your proof, and stick to it. And I believe that most of the American public out there believes we have proved this. If you look at the opinion polls for the last 50 years, and I have done this, I looked at every opinion poll I could find since 1947, and we've seen a growth in public opinion up the first 10 years to a very high level. Anywhere from 50 to 90% of the American public believe these are real. And that has remained consistent. Recent polls still show the same data. And what does that mean? That means to me that the American public says UFOs are real and somebody is lying to us. And that's pretty scary. We ought to have more confidence than that in our government. I consider that one of the bad outcomes of all of this. I think one of our duties is to try to help bridge that gap and bring credibility back to the government on this subject. One of the things that caused this, though, was the Air Force's technique was to look at a UFO case, examine it, whether they did it by telephone or armchair or field work, and then close the case, say unidentified, not enough evidence, or identified as a balloon or whatever. Put it away. Another case comes along, they do it again. They never dealt with that as a body of evidence other than statistically. They never took all the cases that had this kind of characteristic, like we picked it up on radar, but we didn't see it visually. They never took all those together and said, what is this telling us, folks? Now, if they did do that together, it's not been recorded in the documents that's been released. I'm hoping they are doing it. Overall, there is no one best case or best evidence. All of this is good evidence, and there is more of it than any of us can deal with. As J. Allen Hynek coined it, it's an embarrassment of riches. We have too much, and I don't like to think it's too much, so I think it's just right. I welcome all the more that we can get, and I welcome you to investigate it. And remember, we do have the evidence, folks. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Thank you. Cross, Oregon State Police, and he was on duty. And when he heard the alert, he went out and was looking in the easterly direction and saw 3 discs following each other. And it goes on to talk about that. And then this agent interviewed Earl F. Patterson, patrolman, Portland City Police Department. And he advised that he was a former Air Corps pilot in World War II. He stated at the time of the radio alert where he was located and all that, and he saw 1 disc going southwesterly over Portland. He said it was aluminum in color, left no vapor trail or smoke, was traveling at terrific speed, faster than he had ever seen any flying object before. He advised that although not knowing the exact size, it was very high up, etc. This was an official military report in 1947. This fits our type of firsthand testimony, and you can't question the credibility. Now, another firsthand testimony, one that I have mentioned before that I was interested in, has been astronaut reports. Most of them have been debunked by the debunkers, not by the people that reported them, not Gordon Cooper or any of these folks. But one that was very interesting to me was on Gemini 4, because it was kind of the start of my time in the UFO field. On slide 3, I'll show you the cover. Observe and have actually observed the facts. That's firsthand knowledge. All of you that investigate UFOs deal with that firsthand knowledge in every case you investigate. You talk to the person that made the observation. Now in slide 2, I'd like to point out that we have a case of firsthand knowledge, and this is a Portland, Oregon police case. It happened in July 7th, 1947. Any of you interested in that date? Roswell. Well, this documents eyewitness reports over Portland, Oregon. And this is a memorandum to the officer in charge. It was originally classified as confidential, and it's relabeled unexplained. That's firsthand evidence. It is unexplained. And what they're talking about in there is when I put it into the proceedings, some of you may read the proceeding and say, well, you got typos in it. Well, there's typos in that document I just showed you. For instance, when they spell pigeons, they didn't spell it the right way. They spell it P-I-D-G-E-O-N-S. And little things like that. And a lot of researchers say, well, it's a government document wouldn't be misspelled, so it's obviously a fake. It's not a fake. That's the way people work, you know. Lots of people can't spell. But what they talked about was on July 4th, a radio alert was issued by the Portland City Police Radio advising all cars and listeners that some fast flying objects were in the air over Portland and vicinity. Upon contacting the radio dispatcher, this agent, that's the government agent that did the investigation, was advised that Kenneth A. McDowell, patrolman, Portland City Police Department, he gave his address and everything, had called in advising the dispatcher of flying objects. And again, this agent interviewed McDowell. The agent had first-hand testimony as well, who stated that he was on duty and in the parking lot of the police station, and this is where he got to the pigeons. At this time, the pigeons became very excited over something and fluttered in the air all at once. We had an animal reaction that this agent recorded in the report, which is kind of interesting. And he, looking around to see what disturbed him, he saw 5 large discs in the air. Not 5 nebulous things, 5 discs. And 2 were flying south, 3 were flying east. And he said he could determine no color to the disc, but advised they were dipping up and down in an oscillating motion and were traveling at great speed. And he went on to say about speed and all. But again, the oscillating motion is very much like Kenneth Arnold had reported just recently before that in Kenneth Arnold's sighting. Nobody connected the two, though, unfortunately. Then this agent went to interview Sergeant Claude. This is the cover of the working paper, the NASA working paper. That's a composite ground-to-air transmissions, and this was recorded in that. You will notice it is unclassified, so it's not something I stole. It's legitimately obtained. On that paper, it does say at the bottom, at the time when it came out, it was exempt from disclosure. Now, that exempt stamp is very interesting, too, because exempt doesn't mean that you can go to the FOIA and get it. You cannot. It's exempt. It's not, even if it wasn't classified, you still couldn't get it. But nevertheless, this is the transcript, and I want to go through this transcript a little bit because this is kind of the way it works in the space program. The folks on the ground, Capcom talks to the crew on orbit. And Gemini 4 was talking through Hawaii. There were certain ground stations back in those days before we had the TDRS satellites that they had to talk through the ground station. Then there was a gap in between the ground station when they couldn't talk. And Gemini 4, Guamas, Capcom, and he said, go ahead, Gemini 4. Roger, we got you green. How you doing up there? Fine. I just saw something else up here with me. Ugh. But just as I was getting close enough to it to get a good picture, the sun got in the way and I lost it. That's real. It's a book that thick. And it describes what lawyers must do to present evidence. It talks about the various kinds of evidence. It talks about firsthand knowledge. It talks about expert testimony, competency of witnesses, demonstrative evidence, authentication, best evidence, official written statements, and that's important to our field, and records, and lots of more things. I mean, you couldn't boil that book down and talk about it all in 3 months. So what I've done is picked out those kinds of evidence. And the first one that they talk about is first-hand knowledge. And according to McCormick, the common law system of proof is exacting in its insistence upon the most reliable sources of information. A witness that testifies to a fact that can be perceived by the senses must have an opportunity to observe